Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to have chosen the best of the parallel sessions. Please feel free to come closer to the stage. This room is very safe. There is no contagious illness, so you can go from behind, where maybe you may have more problem to listen to what the expert will say. Thank you very much. So now we will discuss about the links between complex sciences and management practice. It's a great honor to talk about complexity between Richard Straub on one side and Franz Josef behind, and with Yves Doz in front of me. It's a great honor for me. But doing it just after lunch is a great challenge, so I will try to make sure that all of you wake up before the next session. I had the great pleasure of experiencing the management of complexity as I was in the automotive industry and in charge of manufacturing flexibility. And at that time, this is how I met Peter Drucker's knowledge and science. I was an ugly tailorist, and I read the book about management, and one sentence, one quote inside changed my whole life, and I recite and use at least once a day this beautiful sentence. It's on page 64. As the purpose of the enterprise is to create a customer, there are two functions, and only two functions that matter: innovation and marketing. Innovation and marketing create value, all the rest are costs. Sorry for those of you who work in finance or in accounting, it's a bad start, but this is the sentence that I keep in mind and I try to practice every day in all the type of jobs I've done before. So, on the corporate side, what does complexity mean? Well, there are many angles and many types of complexity in human management, of course, in resources management, of course, but mainly in the corporate world, it is the question of offering more innovation and more flexibility to the customer that leads to complexity. And the problem of complexity is that complexity costs, and costs a lot. The consultant company, Bain & Company, have shown and made a big study 3 years ago showing that complexity reduces revenue of companies far more surely than the size of company do. So complexity is more energy and resources consuming than the problem of the size of the company. So as the Professor Clements at Wharton quotes it, complexity accumulates over time, and as it is very difficult not to add new customers, not to extend product lines, not to add new technologies, not to add new skills, therefore there is more and more complexity and more costs. One solution would be to keep it simple and stupid. Unfortunately, this KISS solution that the majority of you know doesn't work at all. Then the other solution would be to simply slash complexity. And this is what Mark Gottfredson from Bain quotes. He says, slashing complexity to zero is not the right answer. There is a famous guy that tried to slash it to zero. It is Henry Ford, when you all remember, made the mistake offering only black cars. And at that time, General Motors came along with colors and overtook Ford definitively. And since that bad days, General Motors has been ahead in terms of market share of Ford, and Ford never went in front of the GM solution. So the solution is probably not to slash. The solution is probably not to keep things simple and stupid, as the story says. The solution is elsewhere. So if we look at the outcome and efficiency of the science of complexity that are used in other fields, in medicine, for example, in astronomy, and in many other domains and fields, One idea would be to try to recycle what has been used, what is available, and what has been working very well in this other domain, and recycle that into the business administration domain. And to do that, we propose you to listen to two experts. On one side, Professor Emeritus Peter Gomez from St. Gallen, who will defend one side of the coin and show how this could work, or the condition, how it could work and maybe not work. And then Professor Stefan Thurner, who will bring the experience and his opinion on how it works, for example, in the field of medicine. Professor Stefan Thurner is at the Vienna University of Medicine and also at Santa Fe Cowboy University. I give floor now to Peter Gomez to present and show us what he thinks in that field.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to get started with a short story that happened to me for a short time. A few years ago, I gave an MBA course presentation hosting students from about 18 countries, and I organized my insights around the thinking of Peter Drucker, which I introduced as one of the leading management thinker of our time. Soon I was interrupted by a brilliant Indian student who questioned raised doubts about the validity of my approach. And he said, "Show me an empirical study of interviews of 100 CEOs worldwide on these topics, and then I will believe you. Insights of one even so brilliant thinker don't count." In today's academic world, counting and measuring means everything. Observing and interpreting is judged as being unscientific. But what are the limits of such an approach in the face of corporate complexity? In my recent time as in managerial practice, I notice a totally different attitude in that field. To quote Nestle CEO Paul Bulcke, he said, "Leadership means motivating people even if you do not have the answers." So good management practice is not based on getting more and more data and more details, but it is about detecting patterns to guide your actions. It is not about prediction of the future, which is in the face of this complexity anyway futile, but it is also about detecting potential future trends, as Peter Drucker has shown us by pointing to the ascent of the knowledge worker. Now, I'm not pessimistic about complexity science, and we are going to hear a lot about that from my colleague. But I asked the question, what can we expect from that? Or what should we expect from complexity sciences, as it is, for instance, done at the Santa Fe Institute? And the question is, how can this knowledge be made available to management practice? It doesn't matter if you have 8 journal publications, in the hundreds. If it doesn't reach the managers, it's of no use at all. How can we use this in the field of management? But let me first say a few words on the fundamental situation. Here is a citation from Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker, in 1957, in his book Landmarks of Tomorrow, he said, "We need a discipline that explains events and phenomena in terms of their direction, a philosophy of purpose, a logic of quality, and ways to measure qualitative change, a methodology of potential and opportunity, of turning points and critical factors, of risk and uncertainty, consonant timing, jump, and continuity. Sounds very modern in my view, but you wouldn't find the word prediction. He says nothing about prediction of the future. Let's take this term prediction. I mean, we often hear this, and we also heard it this morning, that there are quite a few people who would like to predict the future. And sometimes complexity science gives you the impression that they might be able one day to predict the future. Let us have a look at a few quotes. The first is by the famous Friedrich von Hayek. He made this quotation in '64 already, and I think it's still valid. Economic theory is confined to describing kinds of patterns which will appear in certain general conditions are satisfied, but can rarely, if ever, derive from this knowledge any predictions of specific phenomena. And I think this is still true. We'll never be able to predict specific phenomena. If complexity science says this is possible, then, well, they have to cope with Friedrich von Hayek, what he was saying. Then a little bit closer to our time, here is a statement by George Soros, as you know, one of the big hedge fund managers of this world, but he also did some scientific work. He says, instead of predicting future earnings and valuation separately, we should try to assess the future course of the entire, initially self-reinforcing, but eventually self-defeating process. So we should, what was said this morning by Professor Novotny, look at the feedback cycles involved in these kind of problems and not try to find, sorry, I didn't set it up. Now, the last one is a little bit more optimistic for the complexity sciences. Financial markets exhibit pockets of predictability associated with pockets of order, just like any complex system should. So there seems to be some hope that complexity science one day will, at least to a certain point, make predictions, and I will be glad to hear from my colleague what he says about this and what he thinks would be, what kind of predictions there are. Now, my points about prediction lead me to another issue in management. I think we shouldn't rely on prediction. We should rely on what we call optimal simplification. So, if in turbulent times it's not possible to predict, what can we do? I mean, one day would be collect ever more data and details about the issue at hand. Some people talk about big data thing and all this, you know, but as we will see, getting more and more data about even smaller things in life, it's not going to help us a lot. The quality, well, I should use that. The quality of pattern recognition and optimal simplification in the phase of complexity characterizes good management. And we have here a good clue by Albert Einstein. He once said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And this but not simpler is very important. There's some kind of a threshold. If you get simpler in complex situations, it's definitely going to be wrong. So these simple management recipes and quick fixes, they're definitely not going to work because they do not consider the complexity involved in those situations. So I think the most difficult thing is to really come close to this threshold where simple still makes sense and where simple doesn't make sense. And I guess that's all about good management, that you find this threshold and work towards this threshold. Now, what's today's management situation? What are we in management? I think we have this very simple situation that on the one hand, the dynamics of managerial situations is on the rise, and the time to handle these situations, the required time, is going up all the time. On the other hand, the time that we have in our hands, the available time, is shrinking. And this opens a huge gap, and everybody who is in management knows this situation. We do not have all the time of this world to apply any kind of complicated methodology. Managers simply have to act in a very, very short time. And we have to ask the question, how can we do that without being simpler, as I said in the terms of Einstein? What happens very often is that people do simply have a kind of simplification that doesn't live up to the task. Very often, I even heard, for instance, once the chairman of Novartis say, well, we better don't have any vision or something like that, just let's act that we act, that shareholders think we are doing something. I think this is, again, on the simpler side, that we were talking about before. But what actually happens when you simplify too much, you have an inadequate goal setting, you have inappropriate segmentation of your problem situation, you have a one-dimensional action orientation, and this leads to neglect of side effects, of oversteering, and then what happens in management very often of authoritative behavior. You see, if it doesn't work, then you command. Command and control if you don't have the right position towards complexity of the situation. Now, how can we get to this optimal simplification that I was talking before? Here we have to go back to one, and I think the only law of cybernetics that Fremont Malik was mentioning this morning, that's Ashby's law. Ashby, already I think in the 70s, said, only variety can destroy variety. That was his kind of popular formulation. But what it means, there's an equation. If you have the complexity of a situation that's expressed in terms of variety, you should, at least on the other side of the equation, have enough variety to cope with this variety in the situation. So, on the one hand, you cannot have very simple quick fix models and cope with variety. It doesn't work. But this is not a way to say you should become more complicated or more analytical or whatever, to complicate your models. That's not the point. And very often in academic work, you just complicate your models, but it doesn't help you a lot to really get rid of the complexity on the left side. Let me just give you a very simple example in traffic. If you were coming from Mars and you were landing on our planet, and you would say traffic on the roads, it would be very difficult to say, why is this somehow ordered, this traffic? And if they have a closer look, at least in Central Europe, there's one simple rule that governs everything, and that is drive on the right side. With this driving on the right side, you have taken most of the complexity out of the system. You have reduced the complexity of the system in a way without destroying it. That's an important thing. You don't have to destroy it. You have to reduce it. Now, on the other hand, we know all just driving on the right side of the street is not the perfect recipe. If you come to crossroads, you have a problem. And so you have to generate more variety on the side of the management to get the equation right. And how do you do it? We had, for a long time, we had this principle of traffic lights. But traffic lights, gave some hints how to solve the problem at crossroads. But it didn't work that much, because you had to wait a long time, even if there was no other traffic from this side or from that side. So what has been reinvented and is now established everywhere, it's circles. At circles, you have the big advantage, that the people in the cars, they have to think. They have to bring in their own ideas, when they can enter the circle, when they can't enter the circle, and so on. And the traffic is moving much more smoothly in circles than it used to be before in traffic lights. So in this very simple kind of illustration, you see what you have to do to come close to optimal simplification is that you have to find out what kind of basic rules govern a situation, and on the other hand, how can I improve my managerial capacity to live up to this reduced variety on the left side. And I think this is a hint to managers that they should first sit down when they have a difficult situation and think about these basic things. What does it mean in management? Of course, it's not that easy. In management, you first have to detect what is the basic business logic of the business at hand. What is the environmental dynamics? There are basic traits in the environment, and you have to detect those environmental dynamics. And what's also very important is the corporate culture. We talked about culture this morning quite often, to find out how the company ticks. If you have those basics of your problem situation, you have reduced variety a lot. On the other hand, how do you go ahead on the variety generation side? We also talked about holistic mapping this morning. This is also a buzzword, but I think just to say, or give one remark to this, we shouldn't rely on singular measures like shareholder value or stakeholder value or corporate social responsibility. I think there's something new that we have to invent, and that's called public value. What does society at large, and that's also Peter Drucker saying, think that's of value to them? I think this is a kind of a holistic value from the point of view of society. You have to use management techniques, for instance, symbiotic kind of management, or as we this morning also discussed, identify your friends and your enemies and then go ahead and so on. And of course, what we need is accountability. Lead accountable leaders. Now, just a few guidelines for optimal simplification. It has also been said this morning. You have to decide which kind of problem you are facing. Is it a simple, a complicated, or a complex problem? I think, was it Don who had this morning 4 categories? He also had chaotic problems. And use the right approach. It doesn't make sense to have a complicated methodology if you have a simple problem. From a scientific point of view, you have to distinguish between organized simplicity, there you can use analytical instruments, between unorganized complexity, there you can use statistics, and organized complexity, and there you can use, hopefully, complexity science. But you really have to be aware. And I think I always tell my colleague professors, before you get started teaching, lie open your assumptions. If you, as an economist, an equilibrium approach, you will get certain results. If it's not an equilibrium approach, you get other results. But unfortunately, most professors don't lie open their assumptions. They just teach what they have in mind. Another point is try to redraw the boundaries of your system so that you actually can isolate generic patterns. It's all about pattern recognition. You have to find patterns in a complex world. You will never be able to detect all the points in it. And that's, I think, will then lead to him, find pockets of order in otherwise disordered situations. I think here maybe this new complexity science might really help us. Let me come to a close. I think good managers can do without predictions about the future. Well, as I said, they're futile anyway. Why should we care about predictions of the future? We're never going to be able to predict the future. But what you can do is you can detect pattern, and if you have a good approach to pattern recognition in complex situations, you're going to be on the good side. But it's very important that you follow Einstein's guideline and live up to Ashby's law, the 2 things I have shown you. Otherwise, you're not going to succeed. Another point that I want to make is early movers or innovators in complex situations, they shape the future. They don't need any predictions, they shape the future. And only after half a year later on, they will be able, if it has been a good thing or not, if it's really going to be an innovation or not. The only ones who can rely on predictions and whatever, following the shapers, are the ones who copy them but who wants to be with them? You know, who wants to be with the followers? That's not interesting. You want to be an early mover. And my last remark, I do not expect wonders from complexity sciences as to strengthen my predictive power. But if they teach me new ways to recognize patterns in complex situations and to optimally simplify, their insights are very highly welcomed. And so I give over to my colleague and hope very much that he is going to give me some insights on that issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always great to be not in another city. I think for sake of the argument, my role now should be to take the opposite position and tell you that no, of course you should all embrace new technologies that we are bringing you from complex system science. Of course, I know that 99%, this is of course a totally hopeless situation. It's an unfair situation because I know that 99% of you perfectly well know that you don't need anything from complex system science. I'm the only person that depends on complexity science because I'm a chair of a complex systems department. And, but I will try to do that task anyway. To start with a provocative statement, if you manage a system, that means nothing else than that you are able to predict the possible outcomes of your actions, of your management actions. If you cannot predict the outcome of your management actions, you neither manage the system nor you control it. You're subject to luck. It's all of us here, we are subject to luck that our things so far worked. If our businesses did not work, we would not be here, so selection bias. We would, yeah, and we are subject to luck, fate, and external events, and external development. So now I get this. Okay. Okay, that was too provocative.
That's mine.
Okay. Okay, so now that's simple. What can we predict? The future, the sales of our competitors. Of course, we cannot do that. In order to do this, we need a hand reader or a fortune teller or a financial analyst. But what would be great is to have some handle on saying something about the consequences, or it would be great to have some prediction measures on the outcomes of our actions. And for that, my claim is it would help if you know who you are in order to find out what your actions lead to. So just a few blah blah slides. So what we know from physics is that if systems are very small, you can control them. If systems are very big, you can control them. Managing complex systems is completely out of scope of mankind since the beginning of mankind. Why is that so? Because mathematics and statistics breaks down for complex systems because of interconnectedness, feedback loops, etc. Complex systems are evolutionary. No one knows what the mathematics of evolutionary processes are really. So far, we had not had much data on complex systems. That's changing rapidly. And a decade ago, we did not have an idea of the backbone of all complex systems, which are networks. We have heard this over and over again today. We're now in the possession of something that's worth being called a theory of networks. Now, in one word, what is a complex system? A complex system is a co-evolving multiplex network. That's all you need to know. I drew a picture of such an object. It's a network, but it has nodes that are in different states. That can be you or your co-workers, and they are linked by different types of links. Can be communication, can be working on the same project, can be the same friends, can be same enemy, that you're enemies, that you're trading something, whatever it is. It's a collection of links. And the thing is not static, but it evolves over time. How does it evolve? The links change as a function of the states of these nodes. States of nodes are here represented by colors and shapes. That could be, for example, I don't know, how rich you are, or what your position is, or how many, I don't know, secretaries you have. It can be anything that describes you as a person or as an institution in a network. So these states change over time as a function of what the links are, of how these nodes are linked. That's a situation that we know from science. You give us a network, we compute what the state changes will be. That's physics, basically. But at the same time, these links change as a function of states. So you have these states change as a function of the networks, and the network changes itself as a function of the states. You have a chicken-egg problem, that's why it's hard to solve it. And we have learned from traditional science that these kind of problems you cannot solve mathematically. Very easy. The game changer is that we now have a computer, we have new mathematics, and we have a new generation of data available. So we have, as I said, we have now network theory. We have, thanks to people like Snowden, we now have big data really available at our fingertips. We have new statistics, ways of making sense of this data. And if you don't have these three components, we are back to the start. We cannot in any way dream of managing complex systems. My claim is, if you can map a complex system to a dynamical network, you have the chance of managing it. So what does it look like to develop a theory of complex systems? It's a very exciting job. I can show you how it looks like. You take the best brain in the world and you work with him. So this is Murray Gell-Mann. He has been mentioned this morning a couple of times. He's the most brilliant mind of the 20th century because he brought order in the zoo of elementary particle physics that was a total mess like complex systems today. And he's one of the persons who brings order into what complex systems are. So this present state mess. So what I would like to do is to view a firm or corporation not as a thing with several departments of purchase, administration, bureaucracy, management, and sales, and things like this. I would rather like to see it as a network, a dynamic network of information flows. Okay? So to illustrate the point, what is a conference like this? The traditional statement is take the program, it's the sequence of talks, panels, and coffee breaks, and gala dinners. But you could also view it something like this. It's who meets whom at this place and who at least exchanged maybe a friendly word or a hostile word. But is it the same thing represented in a completely different way, and we want to go in this direction. So a firm or corporation is a co-evolving multiplex structure. Now, a corporation or firm is an evolutionary network of communication flows. Management does nothing else but control and manage and reshape eventually these flows. Management tries to rearrange these networks. With and without management, these networks will restructure, it will evolve, it will rearrange. Whether it goes in a direction that you want or not is not clear. Okay, what I would like to show you is that there exist a couple of tools from complex system science that you get to know a little bit about your network. you find ways to rearrange it and to monitor the change after you take a managerial decision or intervention. Okay, let me note that it's not easy to tell a network how to rearrange, but who am I telling this? So imagine a new CEO comes to a company, it has 1,000 employees, something like this. You know the organization chart, but of course you don't know at all who talks with whom, what the departments really are, and what the hierarchies are. You have a guess of the situation, but you don't know the reality. You don't know the communication flows. So you would like to know how hierarchical is the firm. If I do some restructuring, meaning rearranging people within the firm or hiring new people, how do these restructuring interventions work in terms of communication flows? And do optimal solutions exist? And given the real structure at a certain point. So the answer to this is communication flows. What is an optimal network? You have to think for yourself what an optimum network is, but an optimum communication network is very often one that you want the right people to talk to each other and to make the people who should not talk to each other. Information flow should be direct, it should not be clustered, and the information flow should be to a certain degree redundant, meaning that if one guy who is a central person leaves, the communication flows are not disturbed too much. So let me give you an example that we are doing. It's a very simple example, nothing deep, that we are doing with an insurance company in Austria, which has about, I think, 400 people. We are looking at their communication flows week by week. We look at their telephone bill, nothing deeper than this, and we look at the email logs. Who sends an email to whom? This is done together with the people, all the employees. They're informed about it. They see the results. What we have is the ID of someone that calls another person. We know the department where this person is from and the idea of who is calling and from which department this person is. Same for the emails. So this is a couple of million emails per month. And this is when you plot these networks, who is calling whom at a certain week. And this is 10 weeks later. And in between these, between week 4 and week 15, there was a major restructuring of exchanging people within the firm. And what you can maybe see is that the structure looks more or less the same. If you look closer, it is not the same at all. So you're seeing a development of completely new information flows in this area. Things break down here, but on the other hand, develop here. What does this help you? Nothing, except that you see that something is changing. You can now do a little bit of mathematics, project these networks into other networks, which are easier to grasp. Now it's not a network, it's a tree. And you see a tree has branches, and the different colors of nodes, of points here is the different departments a person belongs to. Every point is a person, or a fax machine, and what you see is that in your firm you have many branches where you have many colors. This means a branch is the reality of which people talk to each other tightly. The color is the department. So the branches should ideally have should have coherent colors. It's not the case here. That was the situation about 2.5 years ago. Now, some things happened in management, people were exchanged, and we monitored this closely this year, again in beginning of the year and week 15. And after one intervention, meaning exchanging about 10 people from one department to the other, you see a massive change of the restructuring of the communication patterns in your firm. And what you clearly see is that you are successful in the sense that you're putting people together in the same physical location that talk much. That's, what are we doing? So we're looking at many things. We're trying to characterize these networks with a collection of 20 measures, 20 indices that you derive from these networks, or some you cannot grasp with a number, you have to draw a graph. We are monitoring these, and let me show what happened over the last 3 years in this firm. We started, so I show you 3 network measures. This is the average connectivity of the email network, meaning with how many people do I have contact on a typical day. So we see that in the first couple of weeks that we were looking at this, the communication density is increasing. We're looking at how clustered are people. How often does the same information go in circles? It's going up. And if we are asking how compact is the network, it's getting less and less dense. It's compactifying over time. These are 3 things that you want to avoid if you don't want to bureaucratize. This is 3 signs that you're going toward more bureaucratization in your firm. After an intervention here, and recently in this year, we're seeing that you can, in fact, reverse the trend, exchanging a couple of people. Average communication density is going down, keeping at a certain level. You don't want to bring that down too much. Clustering, you would like to avoid as much as possible. So here was a measure that really addressed this and was successful, and compactification could be reduced. So we are all aware of the danger of bureaucratization. What we are monitoring here is how more or less bureaucratic does your firm get over time. And yes, I will not tell you what Parkinson's law is. I think that's your major enemy anyhow. I'm just summing up. Complexity arises through the interconnectedness of components. Interconnectedness we represent by networks. Networks are mathematical objects. We can treat them as mathematical objects. We need new mathematics for it, but we can do that. If we can map a complex system to a dynamical co-evolving network, there is the chance of really technically managing it. Like we can technically manage to go to Mars, or that India can go to Mars. If we conceptualize a firm as a multiplex network of communication flows, multiplex just means that we not only have emails, but also telephone and joint projects, friendship networks, etc. If we look at firms as overlaid networks of communication, then you can ask these questions to your firm. What is the actual structure, hierarchy? What are your departments really? Do you have effective communication flows, in your opinion, as a CEO or not? And you can, of course, relate efficiency to your network structure, or to the network structure of your departments, or whatever you want. So you can use, I think, these relatively simple tools. There was nothing mind-blowingly complicated, what I've told you so far. You can use these tools to monitor the restructuring of departments. You can monitor interventions that you take. You can identify core employees. What's them? These are those employees, if you take them out, the communication network breaks down massively. You want to do something about keeping those. And let me maybe close with a statement that we are living in times of big data now. And as we know from NSA, what does that mean? That means that many people can learn about you at tremendous rates. So maybe there's an edge that you keep up with that learning rate that others might have about you, about yourself, that might give you an edge in knowing who you are. So this is, I also need a philosophic statement. Other intelligent people have been quoted. So know thyself, that's at least a quote from Socrates. Thanks.
Thank you. So now we have had the very simple but not simpler and not simplistic part, and now we will add some complexity with the questions coming from the audience. Who wants to start? We will take a batch of 2 to 3 questions, then our 2 experts will answer. Who is ready to raise the hand for a first question? And how does complexity science help for management practices? Not for the moment. Maybe I can raise the first one. Somebody in the, okay, I will just raise at the same time the first question. We have seen the contribution in terms of prediction, and we see that prediction may not be the right question. And then we had the demonstration of the contribution of complexity sciences on the event, on the simplification. We see that in both cases it works, and the question is, today, are the complexity science a way to predict or a way at first to know how things are? Are we, as in medicine they say, in anatomy, or are we already in physiology?
You're asking us?
Yeah, you're asking us. And then I will have the first question there and another there.
But I think it's definitely a way you can approach very specific problems. You know, I think the problem with this approach is, first, it's always with hindsight. What you're actually doing, you're not doing tell me anything about what I should do in the future, and you need the past to develop this kind of network analysis. And we had yesterday, we had a CEO roundtable, and it was definitely said, if you are on the innovation track, nobody is going to be able to say anything about the future, if it's going to be successful, if it's not going to be successful. Yeah. After half a year or after a year, you know if it has going to be successful. And I think I'm actually not so much looking for prediction of the future, because I'm absolutely sure that there is no prediction of the future possible, because of all those self-defeating and self-enhancing feedback mechanisms that work. And with the communication area, we had this morning many examples that communication flows, they move in such a time, you know, and it's high speed in all different directions. And I think if you have a discussion flow from one person in one organizational unit to the other, maybe there are tens that are on the informal way, you know, and I think very often the informal ways, they actually have the most influence on managerial situations. It's not the formal communication flows that play that much a role. So I would say this kind of approach has its advantages, but I think they only can be applied to a very limited area in management, you know, especially, you know, as a manager, you have to take so many decisions in such a short time, you know. If some turbulence arises in the environment, you cannot go first fill your computers with these things and find out who communicates with whom. If you have an information like, if somebody leaks, in, let's say, in the context of NSA, or if there's any leak in a company, you cannot do these kind of analysis, you know, because the result comes half a year late. So you have to have ways in management to really react immediately and in the right way, and this without being able to do any predictions. And I don't think that this methodology is going to fulfill any requirements in this aspect, but maybe it's not designed for that kind of purpose. You say if you want to have a longitudinal kind of development that I would like to observe and say if the movement from my organizational structure to another has improved the situation of or reduced bureaucracy in an organization, then I say, fine, that's a great thing. But it's just a very, very tiny piece of what management is all about.
Thank you, Stefan.
Yeah, so, but it's certainly not my message to use this example as a last thing. But what I'm saying is that there is ways to monitor and continuously monitor what you really are. A network of communication flows is a complicated thing. It's an object. It's like a ship. It's one of these ships that Joseph Conrad is describing with 3 masts and 18 sails, and it's a very delicate thing. And you're not always at battle, but you're training decades on that ship before you can really sail it. And if you then come into a battle situation, then you can master that ship. And that's why we are proposing to monitor what your firm is, to operate a network of communication flows. It's a fascinating new way of thinking, I guess. And let me also say that I showed you very simplistic. This is not the high end of complexity science. What complexity science is doing, I think serious complexity science is doing in terms of prediction is not to predict future. That's nonsense. Complexity science is talking about phase transitions. Systems, simple systems, such like water, just atoms or molecules, exist in 3 phases, okay? It's vapor, it's liquid, and it's ice. It's one and the same thing. Just if you have a different temperature, it has completely different physical properties. Complex systems have much more complicated phase structure, meaning that one and the same thing exists in different phases, has completely different natures. And you have to know about when you go from one phase to the other, when you're changing the nature of your system. And that's, I think, where the focus of complex system science is. And it's starting to show off some effects, like in, for example, regulation of financial markets.
Thank you. May I just add it, just a short, when we talk about complexity sciences, there's a very specific kind. You know, I'm talking about the Santa Fe kind of complexity science as it is done there. But I mean, there is a huge number of heuristics that are used that also tackle complexity in managerial systems, but they are totally different. It's not a big data thing, you know, it's kind of simple in the sense of Einstein's simple rules that govern management, and there's a whole set of heuristic that works. So we really have to make a distinction, you know, it's not that we can say this is the one thing or the other thing is we don't have it, but here we are talking about what comes under this scientific term complexity science.
A question there, and then one question here.
Okay.
Don't forget to... Works? Doesn't work? The microphone down?
Hello?
Okay, you're good.
You hear me? Okay, good afternoon. So I am Livio Nadalescu of Avansis, Washington, D.C. Quick question picking up on the quantifying complexity idea. So in my work with strategy, innovation, human decision, I've come to regard and appreciate complexity for its qualitative aspects. So Stefan was talking about phase transitions. I see those as a qualitative mechanism to make a qualitative leap. So I'm curious. I've also worked with network theory in mapping out air transportation systems. So I'm familiar with network dynamics and using simulation, using network theory to simulate complex systems. But I'm worried a little bit, and this is, I guess, primarily a question to Stefan, of this idea of quantifying complexity, because it may again take us away from the human from the human side of complexity, which I think, imagination, creativity, I see it as a qualitative process primarily. So I was curious as to your thoughts on that.
Okay,
Thank you.
And now this question, and then we will, please.
Sure. Ben Ramelingham, I guess my question's to both of you. There are all kinds of approaches that 30 or 40 years ago would have been seen as far too complex to really use in business decision-making. Perhaps the best example is game theory. You can get very elaborate mathematical forms of game theory in journals which no one ever reads. But now, actually, game theory can be internalized using a series of rules of thumb into managerial decision-making. So and in the dialogue I've had with people at the Santa Fe Institute who are looking at social complexity, and you'll know some of these people, Stefan, yourself, they talk about the fact that we don't have those rules of thumb for complexity science as a whole, which encompasses network theory, but also ideas of agents and ideas of nonlinear dynamics and ideas of systems themselves. But we are getting close towards getting those rules of thumb through applications in areas which are data heavy. So you mentioned financial services. One of the case studies in the book I've just finished off looks at how Médecins Sans Frontières worked with some non-linear dynamic specialists to map the epidemiology of measles in one of the poorest countries in the world. And by doing so, we're able to propose approaches. This is in humanitarian aid, which is just as fast-moving, just as challenging as the managerial situations you described, but where they were actually able to get people like that working in operational units. And actually in the military, there's already a lot of application of exactly this kind of thinking in operational settings. And I know the Santa Fe works with people at DARPA to develop real-time learning using complex systems tools. So I just wonder if you're being a little bit cautious or a little bit tentative, or is there stuff that's already happening that we aren't talking about in terms of operationalizing complexity in decision-making?
Thank you. So Peter, maybe, Stefan, on your opinion on these two questions?
Yeah, the first question was on phase transition, and that you think that it might serve as a nice qualitative picture. Let me stress, the challenge of complex systems is not to have a nice qualitative picture. This is what we have had, and we can go on doing this, but then the challenge for the kind of science of complex systems is to make this quantitative and predictive. We are at this stage, we are at a very early stage, but we are now figuring out what the temperature is in the case of water. Okay? For water, we figured it out 1 million years ago, that it freezes when it's 0 degrees. But now we are developing quantities that serve as the role of temperature, which allow us to say in what phase are we now under these conditions. And these then might really help and be useful to management, if you know in what phase of state you are, or the environment is.
What maybe, I think we can maybe, this is another question, but maybe to the first one, I think we really have to make this distinction between simple, complicated, and complex problems. And I think we are talking here about complicated problems. Logistical problems are normally complicated. There might be some change in it, but it's not that a company, let's say, some kind of issues suddenly change their face entirely, and that's what management is all about. So a real complex problem changes not only the number of parts that are interacting, but the kind of interactions. And of course you can say, well, if somebody communicates with somebody else and then changes this communication to another person, I wouldn't say that has to do with complexity, Complexity has a lot to do, for instance, and Soros, when I'm talking about Soros, this hedge fund manager who had beaten the English pound by then, he talks about reflexivity. If people in financial markets, they're not deciding on facts or opinions, but they're deciding about people, what they think about these things, and again, they think about things that others think about, and so on, and this reflexivity, this simply you cannot model. It's impossible. I mean, you cannot say, well, it's the same as molecules in water and so on. So, I mean, you really have to decide and say, it's the same thing if you have a mathematical model in economics. if you have, you said it's an equilibrium model, then of course, if you apply this technique, you can say something on what's going to happen. But it has been shown that in financial markets, it's power laws that reign the whole thing. That's in a binomial distribution, that's somewhere 60 things out there, you know, and it should happen only every 30,000 years, but unfortunately, in the last time, it happened every year, or every second year, you know. So if you have to, if you use this, you know, the same with you, you have to lie open your assumption and say, I have this kind of problem, and I apply it under these and these assumptions, and then you're absolutely clear what kind of problem you are tackling with. But of course, you know, if you want to have a distribution of your retail shops, an optimal distribution of your retail shops in the country, that's easy. I mean, you just have to study it long enough, or if you want to find out how a Swiss watch works, if you study it long enough, you will find out one day, and then you will never forget it again, you know. So, but these kind of situations that we are handling here, they are of a totally different nature, and this, in addition to this, comes what we talked this morning, that the self-organizing communities of people all over the world who communicate with each other, and fortunately also not only due to NSA, nobody knows who is communicating with whom. You know, in a company you might find out, and it's going to be difficult anyway if people accept that. If you control all their emails in a company, you better don't do this, you know. So, see, I mean, I see some limitations, but I give you credit, you know, for what you are trying to do, but you should be really honest about the prerequisites.
Good. A comment on the second question?
Good, but okay.
No? Okay. Another question, so from the audience. Yeah, on the right. Thank you.
I'd like to continue your model of
His
water,
question,
which is very simple.
Yes, we did not go into your question.
Okay, we will do it just after this question.
Let's go back to your water model.
To what?
The water model.
The water model.
Phase change. If you cool water slow enough, it freezes at a different temperature. Yeah. In other words, there's a time effect also, known as super whatever. How does that come into your models here? Because as Peter just said, things change rapidly. So using this kind of network, which is an equilibrium model, does not fit at all. So how would you include that?
I give you an answer. Yeah. I'm a physicist, so I give you an answer from that perspective. Let's stay with water. Up to 10 years ago, you could not make agent-based models. You don't call that in physics agent-based models, but it's what it is, to understand what water is. You could not find out that you can, under certain conditions, cool it lower than 0 degrees and still have it liquid. You did also not understand the 18 anomalies of water. But nowadays, you can do that. In the same way, I think it's totally unfair to say, now complex systems science should have the answers to all of this. We needed 50 years of development of now being able to simulate water. How long did it take to make weather predictions which are more or less correct now? It took 300 years. And I'm not saying we are there. I'm not saying buy my things and consult me and pay nice fees. I'm just showing you what's going on, and we are living in a world where companies will very soon, I think, look very different. If we think of these participatory things that we have seen in the first talk, where all out of a sudden hundreds of thousands of people start contributing to, okay, now we have seen scientific endeavors, but if creativity in that direction is keeping up at a certain pace, I tell you it's going to be necessary to think about communication flows and how to manage them. I think it's just a guess. I cannot predict.
Maybe his question.
You mentioned game theory, and my take on game theory is that was a great thing when we did not have a computer. That was the top thing. You could work on complex systems issues without a computer. It's a fantastic thing. But no one from the inventors on ever said this is the full story. Now we are in the cool situation that we can combine game theory with computers on networks, on multiplex networks. And you know from Santa Fe Institute, many things are.
And what about fractals?
Fractals is a tool that you are a mathematical description that you use as a tool.
And can this be used in this kind of context?
Fractals. Fractals always appear if you have nonlinear systems. All of complex systems are nonlinear systems. You just have to tell in what space you want to project a fractal. But fractals everywhere.
Okay, next question from the audience. Yes, on the left.
Thank you. Where do you think it's going to be?
Yeah,
Sorry, David Prale from Help the Hospices UK and the Worldwide Palliative Care Alliance. When do you think it's going to be possible for software to be available for organizations to map their own network flows very simply, or is it already? And that's the first part. The second part of the question is, given the visuals, which I find very engaging, would you say that there are some visuals of networks which will depict healthier organizations than others? And will future generations be asking to see such visuals before they decide whether they want to work for someone?
Well, I would guess it's a brilliant take. So, of course, I would like, if I could read visuals of networks of a firm, if I start working for that firm, I would like to see such a thing. But I think if you show me such a thing right now, I won't be able to read it or to make sense out of it. I think that we're not there yet to simply read dynamical network structures. In terms of your first part of the question, I think firms are looking at their telephone bills, and there is also other people looking at your telephone bills. That was my last point. So, and they can also draw your networks. That was my last point. That much of this information is more open than you think.
Okay, Peter?
Well, I mean, I think that for a toolbox, you know, and for certain kind of problems, these are new approaches that we can definitely use, you know. But I think we cannot, the complexity science in this, well, I was saying before, we should make distinctions what is complexity science and what not. This kind of complexity science is not, it's just in its first stages of being developed, as you said, with the water problem and so on, and we are going to learn a lot about it. But I think the problem is that there are certain limits to this, you know, as to the simple limit with Einstein that we cannot overcome. And I think that's the point, that these kind of systems, you know, where human activity is the decisive factor, they will never be able to be modeled in a way, you know, that you can finally, well, you can always explain it with hindsight, but it would be interesting to see in which kind of direction these systems move. And maybe you can say some patterns, it's moving, it's in complexity science has some approaches that tells you in which direction a certain company or certain an issue or an environment can move. That's possible, a kind of a direction, but you will definitely never be able to make predictions as to the point where it is getting. We can talk about the direction. And I think what we have actually learned in management science, to rely on heuristics that come from other disciplines, you know, like cybernetics, or it could be biology, or it could be physics, and so on. And for instance, for me in my life, the most interesting kind of advice I ever heard was by a cybernetician. That was Heinz von Förster. He said, decide always in a way that the number of options go up. I always lived according to this device, except when I got married.
Good, excellent. Another question from the audience? Yep, on the front.
Timo Hämälän from the Finnish Innovation Fund. I wonder if this complexity network techniques could be used to operationalize the measurement of the complexity gap according to Ashby's law. I mean, whether it could be used to help management to see whether they have requisite variety in their organization vis-a-vis the environment.
Maybe I don't know what that law.
Well, I could imagine, you know, I mean, it's of course we will never be able to definitely to the last number say what the variety of a situation is and what your own variety is. But if you have some instrument that tells you, for instance, that environmental variety, that on the issue you are talking about, that it is highly diverse, but there is some pattern in there, and this could definitely help, you know, then you don't have to build up on the managerial side a huge machinery. Then you can say, okay, I can handle this situation with certain heuristics, and I don't need a huge model to cope with this, what's happening there in the communication flow. And in this respect, you know, it could be definitely an instrument to get a better feeling if you have this equation right, you know, between variety on the environmental side and your own variety. I mean, in this sense, anything that helps in this respect. I mean, what I actually said is, what definitely not helps is collecting ever more data, collecting data. This is not going to help you a lot in complex situations. You should detect patterns. And if this is a methodology to detect patterns, that I can finally decide I can use this, and this kind of protein management to handle it, then it's highly welcome. But I think that's about it, what you can expect from this kind of complexity sciences.
So what my take on your last comment would be collection of data by itself, I agree, that will not gain you anything. You have to put it into a model, into a framework that then helps you to find out what is causal and what is random. So, and if you take, for example, these co-evolving multiplex networks, these networks that I've put up there, there's a mathematical structure behind it, and you can directly feed big data into that. So all the components that are in this thing, you can feed into it, you can get out parameters. And in this sense, I disagree a little bit that that we will never ever be able to make pretty good predictions. Let me give you an example where owners of a massive multiplayer online game, that I don't know if you know what that is, it's something like Second Life, the biggest game in Europe for this. It's called Pardus. It's played by 500,000 people, and we know everything about these people. These people are avatars, and they're living in a virtual world. We know everything about them, who they meet, who they communicate, what they work, what they produce, what they sell, where they go, etc. And you would be amazed if you put this kind of massive data, only Snowden has better data, by the way, if you put this in such a framework, what you are able to predict, down to the individual level. If you know that the player is female, playing in Japan, having these avatar friends, having this wealth, you can predict next action. So I don't know if this is working all the time.
But it has to do with, I think, what you can do when, that's also what from complexity science comes, that you said, if you have a certain set of individual persons behaving in a certain way, add more people to this basic unit, and you will be able one day to get a group behavior that might be somehow predicted, you know, these kind of things. You know, I mean, look in the stock market, you definitely cannot predict what a singular person is going to do in the stock market, but if you have a certain group of investors and you know their behavior, and especially if you know what their behavior know from other people and so on, you might be able to make some predictions. For instance, it is much better that's a newer thing from complexity science, that you look at the development of the stock market, of the courses in the stock market, to do in the next move then to look at the basics of the company. That means group behavior, prediction of group behavior might have some possibility to do more predictions. On the individual level, you can forget it, but on the group level, it's possible. And if you find those things, for instance, and I guess there are so many group phenomena. I mean, the movie we have shown this morning, the bird movie, I think this is not a chaotic movement. It's very, very regular movement, I think, how the moon could be described, of course, not the singular thing, but the pattern. I think if you can find those things, then complexity science might help us, in management to make better decisions.
And so I have a personal question, being the president of a business school. As you said, Peter, in the most complex system, there are pockets of order. And one of your recommendations is to identify the pocket of orders and then make sure that there is some possible rational action. So should a recommendation for business schools be the following: learn to the students how to identify this pocket of order and only use managerial techniques and methods on that part of the complexity? This would be one option. The second option would be, although complexity in certain part of the system has no pocket of order, maybe let's use the medicine called management on the system, and never knows, maybe it works, because in medicine sometimes people don't know why it works. So what would you recommend for the future of business schools? Only pocket of order or everywhere?
Well, it depends what you are aiming at. If you want to be an innovator or a shaper of the future, you probably don't rely on pockets of order. But if you are a follower, there was an approach like PIM. And PIM is a kind of, maybe you remember that some decades ago, you said what makes successful companies in certain market structures. And this was great for followers, then there was kind of pockets of order they could follow, but that's nothing for people who want to shape or want to innovate and want to be the market leader. So, I mean, it definitely makes sense, if you have certain patterns, what kind of market strategies you follow and so on, and you see how the successful ones did it, but it could, of course, go into a totally different direction if the market breaks down or whatever. But I think that's what we are teaching at business schools. We are teaching on the one hand to have the basics of management, to rely on those things that somehow you can grasp, and can say, well, if this happens and this and that, and if you have certain boundary conditions, then you should do this and that. But on the other hand, and that was said this morning, what you actually should do is to put people into an environment that makes them to be creative and be innovative, and that's a totally different approach. I think you should have both things at the business school, but pockets of orders are there, and you should make use of them, and you should teach the students how to do it.
And you, Stefan, you would be arrogant enough to tackle the whole complexity, or only the oases and the pockets of order? As long as you believe in pockets of order.
No, as a scientist, I love pockets of order. Yeah. I think the history of science is identifying pockets of order.
Good.
But I think there's also, one should not only focus on those. Some systems are such that understanding the pockets of order in them will not help you understand the whole thing. That's what complex systems are. And I think if you just focus on the orders, on the pockets of order, in Einstein's words, you're too simple.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Good. Okay, we are going to the end of this session. If there is another question or another contribution, we'd be very happy to listen to it and try to answer. Yes, on the middle,
Thank you. Stefan Schepers from Brussels. The presentations by the two professors were extremely interesting, but both talked primarily from the perspective of the company. Yet, I'd like to advance that public governance has to deal with even far more complexity than a business manager. I am, in fact, in Brussels an advisor on governance innovation, which has become a hot topic since the Eurozone crisis. And this appears to be really about finding new ways to managing complexity. You can no longer do this simply with regulation. You have to enter into entirely different forms of governance, experimental, collaborative, what have you. No country is yet there, and the European Union certainly isn't. I would be very interested if the two professors would give their views on the application of what they just were telling us about complexity for companies, for public policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Maybe I can try. First, we're talking, there seems to be a big advantage of networks. Would it be loosely coupled system or strongly coupled system? Now here, I would say loosely coupled system by private-public partnerships. And not as it has been done in the past, it should be done in a way that the public domain, they are equal partners to those companies, not just giving money if we have to develop something, but being an active investor, you know, or playing an active role. And there are certain approaches that these private-public partnerships are going to gain in importance. And I think by tackling difficult, complex problems together, if the public affairs area and the private area, if they join forces, I think that's a very useful thing, and there are new approaches in this direction. The other thing is, it has to be with the measure how good you are as let's say, a public affairs institution. And that's what I was mentioning. In business, you have all those different measures like shareholder value, stakeholder value, customer value, and all who they all might be. But I think what's coming in the private area, and this is also comes more or less from this public area, is the concept of public value. How valuable is an institution to the public at large? And the problem we have today with these kind of approaches, for instance, the most modern one is shared value by Michael Porter. You know, we had this in I think two conferences ago. The point is what they say with shared value. If we as a company X are getting more productive, our stakeholders should also get more productive. This doesn't make sense. How do you know if they want to become more productive? What is valuable to these people, you know, and these companies and the society at large? They want to participate, they want to utter their opinions and so on. They not necessarily want to get a bigger piece of pie, they want to participate. And if we use this approach to measure also for public affairs institutions, that we actually can have a new measure that mirrors what society is expecting of you, then you are going to make a big advantage. And the same thing happens in private companies, you know. Up until now, if you, for instance, when Apple got this problem and they said, well, you are cheating with your taxes, you know, what did they say? It's all legal, you know, we are moving just between countries. Society at large says, we don't care if this is legal, it's absolutely not legitimate. So what we have to move also in companies, and this is going to be the big thing, to say, how do you measure what is legitimate for a company, for a bureaucracy, and so on, and how we can go ahead with these things. And the new measures are going to be these ones, you know, it's your license to operate is given to you, and that's Peter Drucker, you know, he already said that in '73 in his book, Management. The license to operate is if you produce value for society. It's not your profit, it's the value you generate for society. And here we are going into a direction, into these two things in management science that are very promising.
Stefan, do you have an opinion for EU or for complexity tackling on the public side?
On the public governance side, I have nothing worthy to say, but about something in between maybe. For the European Commission, we are working a little bit on thinking of alternative ways of regulating financial markets pretty much along these lines, where we try to use a combination of a little bit more transparency on the financial networks that exist. It's a very similar network, not information flow, but now flows of funds and derivatives, etc. And this we try to use and combine in a way that you can let people then self-organize the system in such a way that the total systemic risk gets minimized. The risk of collapse of the system that we have experienced. This was one of the examples where we have a rapid phase transition from a highly leveraged financial system to one where leverage is drying up, where we are now, which might have implications for real economy, but let's not go into that.
Thank you. And to maybe contribute to the question and the remark you did on public policy and complexity, probably one thing that can be definitively stated is that the limit or the border between complication and complexity is not the same for public system as it is for the corporate world, probably. And there are many confusions between what is complex and what is simply complicated, also that bring another level of difficulty in the process. And I think that there are two big movements to do. One is to identify the pocket of order, and the other one is to separate what is complicated from what is complex. And this is today what is sometimes difficult. Look at how we started in this session. Somebody raised a very accurate and very concerning question, but the reaction was, this is not complex, this is logistics, it's complicated. I don't say just complicated to diminish and downplay it, but it's complication versus complexity. And I think in public organization, I manage a big public organization, and I think there is more for the moment complication than complexity. But I'm not in Brussels, I'm in the countryside, far from that place, so of course your contribution is a major contribution. I prefer to be in my shoes than in your shoes, and even in Vienna. That's it. If there are no other contribution or remarks on this very hard topic, but really passionating topic, I would like to thank you all for listening so quietly to this session, for your contribution. And I would like to thank our two great contributors for the nice pedagogy and the effort they have done to make it understandable by people that even are not in complexity science. Thank you very much.